some of these self-help things, Rocket Lawyer, LegalZoom, they're not bad. I mean, I'd rather you have something than nothing, but try to choose those advisors that mesh with your values, like your friend. I'm so sorry to hear that, because one of two things is happening. She's either not getting good advice or she's not listening to it. And if she's not listening to it, it's because she doesn't have the advisor that can help her actually hear it.
Here's the uncomfortable truth. Wealth doesn't just disappear because of bad markets or bad luck. It erodes through silence, neglect, and unprepared heirs. Today on the Executive Connect podcast, we're joined by Andrew Howell, co-founder of York Howell and COREnology, who has dedicated his career to helping families preserve what they've built instead of watching it evaporate. We're talking today about legacy, purpose, and why just writing a will is the fastest way to lose everything you've worked for. If you've ever wondered how to pass down not just your money, but meaning, this conversation is for you. Welcome today, Andrew.
Melissa, thank you so much for having me. What an honor to be here with you.
Now, you've seen families build incredible wealth only to lose it with a generation or two. Why is it so common for people to lose their generational wealth? And what are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about inheritance and legacy?
Well, there really is four reasons that I think the wealth doesn't make it to the third generation, or that's that old adage, shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in three generations, where the first generation makes the money, the second generation spends it, and the third generation is headed back to work. And the four things are this. First of all, the division of the estate. You do not see wealthy families breaking up their wealth, right? The Rockefellers, the Rothschild, they're not breaking up their businesses. Yeah, they've got diverse ownership of those businesses, but the wealth stays centralized. You take a husband and wife, let's say they're worth $100 million, really big estate, and they have four children who have four children who have four children. By the time the money gets down to the great grandchild level, just from division alone, everybody's getting 1.5 million, which is still a lot of money, but you can't do with 1.5, you can with 100 million. You lose the leveraging power, you don't get the same interest rates. And, so how do you keep that wealth from just dissipating? The second erosive effect are taxes, and being efficient with your tax planning and being purposeful. And with these large families worrying about this estate tax, I mean, right now, most families, I don't think, have to worry about it. Under current law, everybody at their passing can give to their children 13.99 million. Next year, 2026, it'll be 15 million. And as a married couple, that's times two. So 30 million can go federally estate tax free, but every dollar above that would be subject to a 40% tax. But this law isn't going to always be this way. I mean, since I've started practicing, it's changed about 10 times. When I started practicing law, the amount you could pass estate tax free was $600,000 per person, with a 55% tax on anything over and above. And there's a couple of proponents for it on the left-hand side of the political aisle that would love you to be able to give away $3.5 million with a 55 to 77% tax. And I just don't think the way things are going, the government's going to need less money in the future, and I think taxes are going to go up. So if every generation's taking a 50% haircut, that money's going away. And then creditors, right? You have spouses come in to your children's lives, and 51% of the time, those marriages are not going to make it. What happens if your money you gave your kids gets wrapped up in a divorce, or they make bad business decisions and they have to declare bankruptcy? If you're purposeful with your planning, you can leave it to your kids in such a way that they can still enjoy it and benefit from it, but it can't be taken from them by creditors. And then the final, and probably the most squishy thing to try to define, is just the misuse of the assets, right? How do you make sure that your kids are good stewards over what you leave them? I mean, none of us really own anything. We're just in control of it while we're on this planet. And then we hope we raise good kids who can be good stewards over it. Now, how you do that, that's where our philosophy and the books we've written and COREnology, which is that families really need to pass on something more than just the wealth, the financial assets, but the intangible assets, the core values of the family, and put that as one of the centerpieces and so forth. So yeah, trying to get rid of those four erosive effects, dividing the estate, dealing with taxes, making sure creditors don't take it, and making sure the assets are used appropriately. Those are definitely the pins, the cornerstones of making this all work.
I love it. There's so much to unpack in what you just said. I love it. It all comes down to a plan to me. And let's talk a little bit past the will. And like you said, that you have to pass the values. So building a living legacy. And I know you've said a will or a trust is not enough. It's just paperwork if the values and vision aren't attached. So talk to me a little bit about why tools alone fail to really stick. I know that I've been part of some of these discussions recently in my family, and I love that you mentioned not just the money, but I think, like you said, the values and how are we moving this to the next generation. So talk to me a little bit about building a legacy that actually sticks. Ready to lead smarter and invest wiser? On the Executive Connect podcast, we unpack executive strategies for wealth and influence. Hit the subscribe button now. Don't just watch, act.
Yeah, it's a generational shift in how we're looking at financial planning and passing on those assets. You go back a couple generations, like my grandparents, the greatest generation, right? They lived through an economic period that was different than what we lived through, right? We all lived through the Great Recession and we were all unhappy. They lived through the Great Depression and they weren't eating, right? There was true economic hardship. And my grandfather, who I talk a lot about, is this big mentor in my life. He had this saying that I always loved, which is money isn't everything, but it sure quiets the nerves. So what happened, as you're coming out of that economic hardship, you have some money in the bank and that feels good, right? You know where you're going to feed your family from. And I think we as human beings, we sort of search out safety. So that's where financial planning really developed. And when I talk about financial planning, I'm putting us all under the umbrella. The lawyers, the accountants, the financial advisors, the insurance agents, right? Everybody that's trying to help advise a client about what to do with their money. Well, it all developed around this premise that what we think a client wants is to take the most amount of money, bundle it up, and pass it on to the next generation without any real thought about the consequences. And then you have the next generation, right? The baby boomers, who lived through arguably the most affluent time throughout history, right? In 1930, the deficit was $1 billion, which would be about 300 billion in today's dollars, not $36 trillion, right? That generation spent a lot of money. And it allowed for a completely different way of thinking and a different hierarchy of priorities. And we lived through social change in the 60s and positive things, right? But our generation, who's now the head of families and the CEO of companies and making decisions, we're going, look, we understand the value of money, right? It quiets the nerves. But we also have seen the negative effects of it being completely unharnessed. And why a lot of one of my critiques of my colleagues, the other estate planning bloodsuckers that are out there, is they think that everybody wants the same thing, right? It's this cookie cutter approach. One of the first law firm I was at is part of the largest law firm in the world now, but it felt like a trust mill, right? A client would come in, you just got a sense of who they were on paper, how much, their kids, how many kids they have, what their net worth was. And then you told them they need all of these things. They need a will, they need a trust, they need a power of attorney. And you're just throwing tools at them. It's like you're trying to build a house without knowing the blueprints. And that just never felt right to me. It's not the way I was taught to practice law by my grandpa, who I mentioned, but it just felt wrong. And so that's the first key, is you've got to really understand the client. And I need to know what their values are, right? I love to know what every member of the family's core values are. We wrote a book in 2015 called Entrusted: Building a Legacy That Lasts, that goes through these principles that we think families adopt to successfully navigate this. And the first one is that entrusted families know who they are and what they believe. And that's a really rare thing for people to be able to articulate these days. I mean, in the past, you knew who you were as a family, right? You had a coat of arms. You maybe had a family motto. Nobody talks about that stuff anymore. We're all on our devices and completely, separated. This requires that, because if, let's say in my case, one of my core values is honesty. And that sounds pretty dishonest coming from a lawyer, but I mean it. And it's because early on in my life, there was a member of our family that was pretty dishonest with us. And that's the interesting thing about core values, is they are absolutely developed based upon your life experience, right? If I learned, Melissa, what your top 5 core values were, I would think that they're admirable. You would think mine are admirable, but there is a 1 in 15 million chance that we're going to have the same top 5 core values, because we've just did different lives. But if I'm having this conversation with my family and I'm explaining to them how important honesty is to me, well, I'm teaching them about their family, right? They know when they go to Thanksgiving, some people don't want to sit next to each other because there's still issues that were caused over this dishonesty in our family. But I'm also teaching them, more importantly, about me, right? Why do they need to be truthful with me? They wrecked my car. We got insurance, but if they lie to me about it, I'm going to be nuclear. And then if you think, okay, we're going to do that about every member of the family, we're going to do it as a family as a whole, and then put that as a centerpiece. Yeah, we want to pass on the money, but we want to make sure it's in furtherance of our goals. And it's just a completely different way to look at it. And then once I know what they want to build, then I can use the wills and the trusts and the LLCs, or going to Nevis and the Cook Islands and setting up offshore trust there, right? If that's what the client wants to do, and that's going to be in furtherance of their goals. I don't know personally, as a professional, how you can do that for a client without getting in there and knowing it.
And it's so true, because I've been through those discussions, and setting up a will and a trust is one thing, but really understanding that it's a living, breathing, changing document is a whole nother thing. I think I love that you mentioned the values and truth and trust, because setting those up, it requires people to be truthful. It requires them to be honest with what they want and what they have. And so how do you, talk to me a little bit about, like your example, you have 4 different families. Like you said, they're all going to have different values. So how would one come to the table to talk about their values, to build a will and separate trust that accounts for everyone and the way they see the future? Like, how would that be organized from your perspective?
Well, we have a very specific way that we like to do it for our clients. And this isn't new. I mean, we wrote our book Entrusted 10 years ago, started writing it 11 years ago. And so, which proves that we wrote it was before AI was out, right? But so we've been talking about it for a while. And over that period of time, we have developed a completely different system for people to actually do this, where we first had it was kind of a card game where you would have all of these values and you would have to trade them, and you'd wind up with the ones that were most important to you. But it would take a family 5 hours to play this thing. And I don't know how hard it is to get your family around the dinner table for 5 hours, but that was a difficult thing. And what's happened now over the last 12 years is it developed into a completely separate company that's called COREnology. And it's a survey. It's a learning software. My kids' college money is in this thing. It's we put a lot of effort into it, but it's really slick. And about 20 minutes for mom and dad, and then about 10 minutes for the kids, it gives them this survey, just asking them questions, and it will pump out very, very detailed report about clearly what each of their core values. Now, that's the way that we integrate it. And then, of course, we have all of the necessary documents to deal with the legalities. Yeah, you ought to have a will, you ought to have a trust, you ought to have a power of attorney document for your healthcare decision making. But if you were to read my trust, my wife and I pass. I have 3 kids. Each of my kids gets a trust that exists for their entire lifetime. I don't give them anything outright. Now, I might let them control it at some point in time, but by leaving it in a trust for their benefit, I can keep it from being part of their estate if they have their own estate tax problems. I can keep it away from their creditors because they're the beneficiaries of the trust and nobody else is. But I can also put the handling of the trust, the investing of the trust, how the money's being used in the trust, under the parameters of my core values and our family core values. And that now becomes direction to my trustee. right? One of the things that I support in my family is entrepreneurialism. Yeah, I'm a blood-sucking lawyer, but I also fancy myself an entrepreneur, right? We started our firm 12, 13 years ago. We started a COREnology. It's fun to build businesses. But I wouldn't just give my kids a bunch of money and hope they didn't blow it in business. And why would I do that at my death? So many times I find that a person's estate plan, even if they have done it, which most people don't, but even if they have done it, would do something at their death that they would not do during their life, right? During my life, I will never hand over money to my kids just outright, where it might go to a creditor or even for a business reason without them doing a couple of things like prepare a business plan. Bring that business plan to the table. Let me work in it with you. Let's see if it makes sense. Work on it together. Then I'm not just going to give you the money. I'm going to loan it to you. And I'm going to expect you to pay it back. You're going to be held accountable to our family. And every year at our family reunion, after we did our potato sack race in the backyard, we get together. We're going to talk business. And you're going to explain, what did you do right with that loan? I know they're going to lose it. We've all lost money, right? If you're not losing money, you're not trying most cases. But I don't want them to all make the same mistake. I want them to be held accountable to each other. I want them teaching each other. I would love it if my kids got into business with each other. I hear this all the time. Don't do business with family. Really? I mean, I guess in some ways, I think that means you failed if you have a family that can't do business with each other. Plus, we go back to that idea of not breaking up family businesses and the power that that can potentially have. So yeah, I probably long-winded there. I sort of give answers in paragraphs, but I have some pretty strong ideas on how that should be done.
This episode is brought to you by Summit Ventures. If you're an accredited investor, Summit gives you access to one of the greatest tax advantage opportunities: direct ownership in oil and gas. Their projects deliver what they call the triple play: cash flow, equity growth, and powerful tax benefits. And here's the best part: these investments qualify for 1031 exchanges. That means you can roll gains from real estate into energy while deferring capital gains. To learn more and get a free white paper, Oil and Gas Demystified, just visit www.summitven.com/executive connect. But I love what you said. COREnology uses structure, conversation, collaboration to cut through the legal, the emotional complexity about trusts and wills. And I think when you gamify it and you make it fun, it makes it more easier to get through. And funny that I love that you said that, because every single business my brother has started, Andrew, I have invested in and been part of every single one of those. He's our family entrepreneur. So I love that you mentioned that. And I think the way to simplify these discussions, and it gets everybody around the table collaborating, understanding it, because some of these discussions can be very emotionally charged. And, people that have made the money, they have different beliefs on where it could go versus the younger generations who are inheriting it. So I love that you discussed that. So let's talk a little bit.
We go in detail through. That's an interesting one. Views on wealth. We have a whole module that just talks about views on wealth because, I come from a different family background. My family was fairly affluent and so forth, where my wife comes from a more less economic background. And so our views on wealth and what we think a good inheritance is for our family is a lot different. And it's really important to feather those things out. When we wrote our book, people were left. I thought two people were going to read it, maybe my mother and then my high school English teacher, because she can't believe I can actually read a book. But it actually had a pretty good reception. But people, I think the biggest negative was, well, great, these are all good ideas, but now what? And that's where it led us into, hey, people really need help starting this discussion and being able to do this with the family. And that's what this is. That's the aid. We license it to financial firms throughout the country. One of our firms that we license it to, if you're a large net worth family, you don't get to even speak to one of their advisors till you have gone through COREnology. And it's because it's the demand in the marketplace. You want to have your advisor. In fact, there's a statistic on this. 91% of clients will say, bigger than the return on their account, they would like their advisors to know their core values. And AI is going to take a lot of financial planning in a different direction. Most of the next generation would rather take their financial advice from AI than go meet with a financial advisor or something like that. So this is a way for us as advisors to connect with not just the client, but the next generation. And not only do I know about the client I'm working with, I know about their kids and maybe their grandkids. And that's not just from a selfish thing, creating potential business for me in the future, but I need to. Again, am I doing a good job for that client unless I know what their family really is like? Sorry, I didn't mean to take you
Yeah,
off. You
and
were
I
going to
think
ask another question.
no, you're spot on. It's a great point. I think unpacking all of that, I think of it like when you first meet an advisor, you're kind of dating, understanding their strengths, they're understanding your strengths. But once you kind of, agree to be a partner with them, you're married to them and you need to unpack all of these things. Are you buying a house? Are you planning on having kids? If not, what do you plan to do with your inheritance? Are you, doing, an impact business? So I want to get kind of your perspective. I think families don't just want to protect wealth, they want to know that it matters to the next generation. So, how do you help clients shift that mindset from one that is just preservation of the wealth to one that's about purpose and future impact?
Okay, so we think it all comes down to expectations, and that three expectations need to be clearly laid out for members of the family. First of all, everybody needs to know what they can expect from being part of the family. There has to be a benefit, right? Otherwise, why do your kids want to listen to you? I mean, really bad example of this is we have a place up in Montana that the whole family loves, and everybody gets to use it as long as they take care of it and leave it better than they found it, right? All that kind of stuff. And so you get a benefit from being able to use the place as a part of the family. Everybody also needs to know what they cannot expect from being part of the family. And I have a funny story on this. When I was young, I was required by my grandfather to work down at his law office, and I was, cocky and pompous teenager, and I made some comment that we were wealthy, right? And my grandpa was this huge 6'2", just behemoth of a man, and never laid a hand on me until this day. And I felt the back of his hand on my collar, and then the next thing I remember is hitting his office floor. He gets up in my face and he says, "I want you to understand something. I'm rich. You don't have," and he said the word. And I never forgot that. I think about that all the time. And what he was doing is he was setting expectation. I can't expect that just because he has money, I'm going to sit there and do nothing. And so they need to understand you're not going to just sit on the couch and eat bonbons because mom and dad have a lot of money. And then they need to know what's expected of them. Everybody needs to know how they're going to plug in. And if they don't plug in, what are the consequences? And I had plenty of clients to say, "Hey, look, my child, for whatever reason, maybe they can't plug in." That's another thing that we try to identify. What roadblocks would keep a family from being able to do this? And certainly, substance abuse issues, or say a child's going through some horrible event like a divorce, which is just an upheaval to your life. So what is something that might be a roadblock? We've got to identify those things. But when are you expected to show up, and what does that look like? And I think that if those three expectations are laid out, then the chances of a good family harmony the year after a mom or dad passes away is much more likely. And in fact, it's about 85% more likely.
And I love that you brought that example up because there's so much in that example. And I think that building a plan and having your children understand the plan up front, understand their responsibilities, understand your expectations, makes it very clear for everyone. And when it's not clear, we get into these sticky situations. And I made me think when you were saying that, my parents they were ones that made us buy a car. We had to buy our own car. And I never understood the logic. If they could afford it and they had one, why couldn't I use it? But his logic was, he wanted us to work for the things we had versus him giving us the things. And once we worked for the things, improved our, knowledge and ability to do it, then he would lean in and give some things. But I think the interesting point about what you said and the interesting point about that story was I understood what I had to do and what I was getting as part of that setup. And I learned that very young. I was in grade school when I learned that, everything wasn't just given to me. There was expectations. And the older I got, the more difficult and the more expectations they had of me, and that I had to teach my younger sibling. And so I think the kind thing about that, when you're younger, you're letting your children understand that there's work to be done and that it's their job to do it. And so I think I love kind of what you guys are doing. It really speaks directly to families, entrepreneurs, and leaders who want their legacies to be not lost, but they want them to thrive on. And I really do believe it starts with a plan and understanding what everybody around the table has to say about that plan. And so, talk to me a little bit more about, families that are, they've been leveraging a financial planner and or an in-house family office, but their wealth is, either they're losing wealth or people are misusing the wealth. I know some people in this situation currently that they didn't have to have a piece or stake in the game, and now, they're not, the wealth is disappearing. So to those people who have kind of inherited a mess, what would you share with them? This episode's sponsor is a couple I absolutely love, David and Alexis Kiwi. They help power couples be successful at home just like they are at work. If you're crushing it in the business world but quietly disconnected from your spouse, you're not alone. Check them out at davidandalexis.kiwi.org. They have spent years creating a simple tool set that will help you save your marriage. Don't forget to use code EXECUTIVE1 to save $500 off their 6-week coaching program. davidandalexis.kiwi.org, code EXECUTIVE1.
Well, I mean, it's all about your willingness to engage, and it really isn't too late to turn things around, which is such a cliched thing that I hate to have even just said it, but it really is true. And we've seen some families really be able to reharness their financial assets and really getting them aligned. We have a family that very wealthy family here in Utah, Salt Lake, and they for every year would just give $10 million away to the University of Utah and, all of these same places without a thought. It was just their donation and it was part of their giving program. And they're now in the 4th or 5th generation of this family. And there's 7 great grandchildren that were just off the rails, substance abuse, you name it. Yeah, just life in shambles. And we said, look, you have $10 million going out the door every year, and you don't have any of that harnessed to any kind of way. Why don't you take the 10 million, put those 7 degenerates in charge of it, and they get to decide what that money's going to be used for. But don't just let them send it off. They have to put some effort into it. When it's really easy to give away somebody else's money. And we always think that to have it really have impact, you have to put one of the 3 T's in it, which is your time, your talent, or your treasure. So for these guys, they had very little talent and only treasure came from mom and dad. So we made them do their time. They had to go down. They had to meet with a group that they wanted to support. Like this one guy who had been through a couple of different rehabs. One of the rehabs he chose, I'd love to say all 7 of them are on the straight and narrow, but 4 of them are. And that kid sits on the board of directors for that program that he used to have to attend. So it's all about being willing to do the work and starting the discussion, and that apathy or just being frozen and not being knowing what that next step is I think usually the biggest hurdle to get over. And if your financial planners that you're working with, and remember, that's a broad umbrella of potential advisors, are not listening to you when you start talking about it, find somebody else. The discussions are going on. These things are happening. Large groups are moving towards this mentality because they get it. They know that if a client goes and meets with them and the first question they get asked is, what's your net worth? Do you like stocks? Do you like treasuries? That's not exciting. I mean, nowhere near as impactful as if the first thing the advisor asks you is, what are your core values? And tell me what you're trying to build with those assets before I still, so it's just a completely different mentality shift. And families, they get it. These aren't new ideas, but you just got to be willing to take that first step.
And I love the idea of the software because I would argue that I don't think everybody could list off their top 5 core values. I don't believe people know them right off the bat and as far as words or to name them. So I like this kind of gamifying to better understand yourself, but to understand it and then put it to use in a clear plan is absolutely brilliant. Because if I look at all my family members, you're making me think now, all of us have different core values, and how we respond and how we work is all very different. And so I think to layer this in a plan and actually have an output is so beneficial to so many families.
Yeah, we really think it's a game changer, and I know I'm saying that with some bias behind it, but I mean it. Over the next 40 years, there's going to be somewhere between 70 to 90 trillion dollars that changes hands from one generation to the next, and it's almost entirely unharnessed. It's going to be the largest wealth transfer in America or in human history. And people, I think, are really going to start recognizing that no, they can identify those things. And how do we do that? Well, you got to have that discussion. You've got to bring the kids in. You've got to have that connection again. And I think it's the way that planners are going to be expected to act. In fact, I think regulatory bodies are going to require it. We were doing a presentation down in San Diego not too long ago, and there was like 2,000 financial advisors in the room. And we were telling them, look, times are changing and clients want other things from you. After that presentation, we had a woman come up to us who was with a former regulatory body it was with the SEC. And she was saying that they're, proposing rules where you need to know what your client's core values are. And that will take precedence over things like diversification and other things that have been the norm because, we're just wanting other things.
Yeah, and I think that's really true. And it's funny. It makes me think to another friend of mine. In her family, the women weren't allowed to have a voice in any of their family, happenings. It was really just the heads of the household. That was their family beliefs, their family values, that the women's role served a point and the men's role served a point. Well, this woman is now entrusted with a lot of money, but has never been coached on how to manage her money and has never married. But in their will, that was part of their family values, yet she's never married and nobody's ever taught her how to manage money. So guess what all her money is in? It's all in cash, millions and millions of dollars, because she never knew how to manage it. So the other side of it too is I think finding the right people is going to be so important, because I think about having all this money in cash, what it's going to do for her long term, and their long term family strategy is also not a smart move. So kind of in closing, I want to get any kind of final thoughts or anything that you want to leave with our listeners that we didn't touch on here today.
Well, sometimes it can get overwhelming. I mentioned earlier, most people don't do any estate planning at all. I mean, 30% of the population does it, which means 70% does not. And it's always in the back of your mind that you should. Hey, I'm getting on the airplane to go on a trip. I'm having a medical procedure. So, go do it. If you haven't, talk to a blood-sucking lawyer like me. There's great ones around the country. I mean, some of these self-help things, Rocket Lawyer, LegalZoom, they're not bad. I mean, I'd rather you have something than nothing, but but try to choose those advisors that mesh with your values, like your friend. I mean, I'm so sorry to hear that, because one of two things is happening. She's either not getting good advice or she's not listening to it. And if she's not listening to it, it's because she doesn't have the advisor that can help her actually hear it. Or the reverse is happening. That advisor is talking and not listening, and she doesn't feel comfortable doing it for whatever reason. So yeah, you guys, people want your business, right? Unfortunately for myself, I'm not retired any quite yet. I'm still working, right? And people out there, they want to work for you and they want to do a good job for you. And lawyers have a bad name for a reason. But if you don't like the one you're with, you don't like the financial advisor that you're with, go look for somebody else and find the people that are going to listen to what your core values really are going to be.
I love it. Such good advice. Andrew, what is the best way for our listeners to connect with you, hear more about the good work you're doing?
Email is always the best one, and it's corny. It's Team Andrew, just like it sounds, at yorkhowell.com. That's YORKHOWELL.com. And that'll just go to my paralegals and my assistants. And yeah, happy to talk to anybody.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your awesome personality, your time, and your knowledge with our listeners. That's the Executive Connect podcast.